with another episode of Motivators Podcast. Today, I am joined with two incredible people. I am joined by Cara Lechleiter, our Director of Sales at Motivity, and we are joined with Matt. Matt, is it correct? Matt Cicoria? Cicoria, okay, perfect. Which is probably a voice that many of you have likely heard. He is the host of Behavioral Observations podcast and a long-standing consultant working in schools to support students with emotional and behavioral challenge. So we're going to get to know a little bit about Matt today, and Cara will be joining our conversation. Yeah. Matt, how are you feeling today? Cara, how are you?
I'm doing great.
I'm excited. Matt, I want to hear all about you and the work that you do.
Okay. All right. Happy to talk about it. So fire away.
So Matt, quick question. First of all, I think you've interviewed a ton of people on your podcast. Do you ever get nervous being the one on the other side of the mic?
Yes. Yeah. Every once in a while when I'm interviewing someone, they'll ask me a question and I always freeze for a second. So it is kind of funny. And my kind of jokey joke response is like, hey, I'm asking the questions here, which gives me a little, it's a rhetorical device that gives me time to think of a cogent answer.
A little buffer.
A good coping mechanism.
Yeah. That's a little podcasting secret.
You just started and we're already getting all the secrets from Matt.
There we go.
But Matt, we wanted to know a little bit about what drew you into behavior analysis. And was there a moment or experience that really hooked you?
Yeah. So ever since high school, I've always been interested in psychology. And as far as behavior analysts are concerned, I am an older behavior analyst. So if the average age of a behavior analyst probably, I'm guessing, has got to be in the late 20s right now. That's a guess. If not, maybe early 30s. I'm 50. So I was an undergraduate in psychology at the University of New Hampshire from 92 to 96, when many of the people right now were maybe being born or something like that who were out there practicing. So I feel like a dinosaur, even though I'm, I don't feel old, but sometimes when I see those statistics, I do get reminded of my age. So I went to the University of New Hampshire to study psychology. I thought I was going to be a clinical psychologist. I thought, do psychotherapy and things like that. I've always been curious about, and I didn't know what it was at the time. I didn't have the vocabulary to describe it, but I've always been curious about memory and associative learning and things like that. And originally I was drawn to cognitive psychology and even aspects of personality and social psychology. And I remember taking my first behavior analysis course. So, as an undergraduate, you take all your general education requirements. Those kind of fill up your first couple of years, although I was taking psych courses. But it wasn't until my junior and senior year I was able to really take mainly psych courses. And I had the opportunity to take this class called Behavior Analysis and its Applications. I didn't know much about behavior analysis other than the behaviorism chapter from my intro psych class 2 years previously. And we read a book called, I believe it was called The Fundamental Principles of Behavior. I have it back on my bookshelf behind me somewhere by, at the time, Mott, Whaley, and Malott. Now there's been numerous revisions of that text. But the cool thing about that text at the time is that the authors did this genius thing. It wasn't just a dry textbook. There were actually characters that were, and the characters' stories were used to illustrate the behavioral principles all throughout all the chapters of the book. So there was I believe there was a husband and a wife, and then there was another guy. One was an academic, one was, a behavior analyst working at the time, what we would consider with folks who were, developmentally disabled. The term autism wasn't quite as, it was around, but it wasn't in the usage that, and the awareness of autism wasn't where it is right now, certainly. And then there was also a character who did OBM, management consulting, things like that. And so the book illustrated the principles through the various stories that these characters encountered, or these challenges that these characters encountered, and how they solve these challenges through the application of behavioral principles. And what was also cool about the book is that even though I think one was a college professor, it was very applied in nature, meaning I think at least one, maybe two of the characters weren't in the academy. They were out doing applied work. And what appealed to me about that were a couple of things. One was the parsimony with which it described behavioral phenomenon. It seemed to logically cohere in a way that other disciplines of psychology did not. And so I was drawn to that aspect of it. It wasn't something so theoretical that I couldn't wrap my mind around it, which is not to say that those concepts and principles don't exist in behavior analysis. There's lots of things that puzzle me about, in certain aspects of behavior analysis. But at the time, just the idea of understanding positive and negative reinforcement, type 1 and type 2 punishment, things like that really just made sense to me. And that, I would say, was a light bulb moment that I was like, wow, I think I really want to pursue this. And so I talked to the professor and he said, well, there's a course coming up after this called behavior modification. Again, I'm dating myself with the name of that course because that's a term that's not used very often anymore, even though there's a journal that is titled just that. But anyway, and so I got to take this course called behavior modification with a guy named Dr. Tony Nevin. And Tony was he's passed now, but he was just a well-regarded, well-published, very productive researcher in the field of the experimental analysis of behavior. And so he had maintained a pigeon lab upstairs on the second floor of Conant Hall at the University of New Hampshire. And I got to talking to him and I was like, hey, this is awesome. It was his last year of teaching. So he was getting ready to retire, but he had his last graduate student, a guy named Dr. Randy Grace, who spent most of his time on that second floor running experiments. And they had lots of grant money and stuff like that. And Randy stayed on the following year to do research to fulfill the obligations of the various grants that they had going. So although Tony left UNH at that point and retired, he would come back up periodically. But long story short is he offered me a job in the pigeon lab. So that was my college work study job. And I remember I was telling the story at a conference a couple of weeks ago. The first day I showed up, I get basically a 2-on-1 class on the matching law from Tony and Randy. So the three of us were in the middle of the lab. There was like kind of an open space in the middle. They had two chairs they pulled up across from me. So basically making like a triangle, right? And they were just downloading everything in their brains about the matching law. And at a certain point, Tony looked at me and he said, we've lost you, haven't we? And I'm like, yeah, yeah, I think I need a minute to take this all in. So anyway, this is kind of a funny moment. But yeah, Tony was great. One of the things that was great about Tony is that he treated me at the time I was 19 or 20 years old, like a colleague, did not want to be called Dr. Nevin or Professor this or that or whatever, insisted I call him by his first name, was very welcoming, patient, etc. Same with Randy too. And I also speaking of the matching law, Billy Baum was still at the University of New Hampshire at the time. So I got to take a class from him on the evolution and behavior, which was fascinating. And so I got at least for the time, a good foundation of the basic principles of behavior analysis, not necessarily much in the applied realm. And of course, behavior analysis was in its infancy at the time. And I realized that, the opportunities to pursue graduate training were paled in comparison to the opportunities that are out there now. So there was it wasn't the case where every single educational institution started creating their own masters and ABA programs that were hybrid and online and things like that. There was no hybrid this, there was no online that. You mainly had email, and that was about as basic, that was about as advanced as it got. So I knew I had to go to graduate school, and I ended up going to Auburn University after applying to a couple of different schools, and that one, based on the schools I did get into, that one seemed to be the best fit. And so that's how I got into behavior analysis.
Awesome. But then there was a time where you studied under Dr. Jim Johnson, right? What was that mentorship like? And how do you feel like it shaped your perspective of the field?
Yeah, so when I went to Auburn University, I enrolled in their PhD program. It was PhD in experimental psych. And again, just to contextualize this a little bit, at that time, behavior analysis, for the most part, was not its own defined field. Behavior analysis was a subset of psychology. So most of the time when you went to go study psychology at the graduate level, you were in a behavior analysis at the graduate level, you were in a psychology program. And we had this wonderful cohort of people in my quote unquote grade, if you will. We call them cohorts, but it's, you could think of it like the, 15th grade or something like that, or 18th grade. I don't know. I had to count up how many that would be. But so we had a wonderful group of folks from all walks of life. Some folks were in the clinical psych program. A lot of us were in the experimental psych program. And what's kind of funny is that a lot of my friends in the clinical psych program are academics doing research in areas like behavioral economics, choice, discounting, things like that. That was really, really hot at the time. And most of us in the experimental program, you'd think would go into some sort of academic track. Most of us in the experimental program are practitioners now, a gazillion years later. So it's just kind of funny how the field has evolved over time. And so I just found that to be an interesting observation looking back at that. With regard to my work with Jim, Jim was great to work with. Obviously, I was a little intimidated at first. We read his book. He didn't, and at the time, he had a ton of research contracts, and his teaching time was bought out by those contracts. So he wasn't teaching, he was just doing research full time. We had read his, Johnson and Pennypacker, the second edition, as part of a research seminar that was taught by a different professor. And I certainly understood where Jim was and his prominence in the field. During my time at Auburn, he was the president of ABAI. I got to see him do the presidential address, and that was great fun. At the time, he had secured a number of research contracts, which are different from grants. We can get into that if you want, but he had secured some research contracts with various federal government agencies to really look at the olfactory capability of dogs. Auburn University has a well-respected veterinary program, and they had their own research lines going there as well. So this was in collaboration with the vet school at Auburn. And it turned out to, I guess, culminate in this entity called the Institution for Biological Detection Systems, IBDS. Basically, what we did is we did contract-funded research to, again, explore and define the olfactory capabilities of dogs, specifically when it comes to detecting drugs, detecting explosives, and things like that. So we had dog-sized Skinner boxes. We had these machines called vapor generators, which generated specific type of, the dogs were essentially doing discrete trials. And we were able to, put in probes to see how they responded and things like that. I won't bore you with the actual procedure, but it was pretty cool. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And so I guess what I learned from Jim is that he approached behavior now. He approached his work there, for lack of a better term, in a very workmanlike way. Jim wasn't the last one to leave the lab, but he absolutely was the first one there. He was usually there like 6 a.m, cranking away on his computer, writing grants or writing contracts, writing updates, reports, etc. He would have lab meetings and things like that. He had graduate students that worked with him for years and years and years. A couple of them, Dr. Paul Wagner, Dr. Marc Williams, folks like that, who were essentially mentors of mine. Even though they were, kind of fellow graduate students, they were many years ahead of me, and they were essentially mentors too. So I approached that work not like a student, but like, hey, this is my job. And I got a half-time assistantship working there. Very quickly got out of the, teaching that a lot of graduate students kind of roped into right out of the gate. So I think I taught for the first or second trimester, and then after that, I worked in his lab for the rest of my time at Auburn. And so and each graduate student in the program was responsible for a particular project. So the idea of like, when I say responsible, like we were responsible for like running the sessions, getting the data, reporting out and things like that. It was serious business. And so I think that informed my approach to a lot of what I've done since.
But Matt, right now you work in school consultation and student behavior, right? So since your focus is on school consulting, especially with students facing emotional behavioral challenges, what does that work actually look like on a day-to-day basis?
So the types of individuals, well, let me just back up a little bit. Like over the years, I've worked with individuals who have, severe to profound developmental disabilities, including autism, and individuals with severe challenging behaviors, serious life-threatening self-injury, pica, physical aggression that put people in hospitals, things like that. And so that was my first experience out of graduate school. And then when I moved back to New England over 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to learn about early intensive behavioral intervention, and so I learned how to do discrete trial training, naturalistic teaching, things like that with kids with autism. So I've done that work, but over the years as a consultant, I have gravitated towards supporting individuals who exhibit maybe less severe problems in terms of danger, as it were, but more chronic and disruptive to their learning and to the learning of others and to the overall, I guess, the overall behaviors that would detract from the learning environment. And so oftentimes these are kids with the various types of, multi-letter diagnoses, ADHD, ODD, you name it. And I really enjoy supporting school staff in this role. It's a lot messier than, I want to say it's not easier, but it's more straightforward to work with individuals. This is my take. It's a lot more straightforward, not easy, but straightforward to understand repertoires of severe challenging behavior. And you also know when your intervention's working, generally speaking, pretty soon into the intervention. With kids with these types of problem behaviors, it's a lot messier. The field's come a long way in terms of understanding the types of things that reinforce problem behavior. And of course, we can go down the rabbit hole of synthesized versus isolated contingencies for just about anyone who engages in problem behavior. But my observations are that these students, the reinforcers are just so layered and complex and therefore difficult to get a handle on. And those reinforcers are sometimes almost impossible to control in these settings where there's tons of people and all sorts of things going on and things like that. And so a lot of my work with teachers involves, well, especially lately, you can approach these cases and do an individualized functional assessment of whatever type you want to do. But these repertoires exist in the context. They exist in the context of a classroom where there are other kids maybe engaging in behavior problems, or where the classroom management isn't necessarily where you'd like it to be. And this caused me to kind of go to the literature to say, to look at, okay, what else is out there? What else is out there in terms of things that can support individuals in these settings? And I started learning a lot of this kind of self-study or just discussions with colleagues. I never took a class in this stuff or anything like that. But I started learning about the contributions of people in the PBIS literature and these kind of multi-tiered systems of support in terms of what are some universal interventions that we can apply either school or class-wide. What are some other maybe less intensive interventions we can use to address problem behavior that don't involve necessarily a full-blown functional assessment? And of course, the functional, those individuals at the top of the tier, if you will, who require individualized supports. And so when I started getting referrals for these kids, I'd go into the classroom and sit down to observe. And I would start noticing a whole host of things. One is the teachers oftentimes would come up to me and say, hey, I know you're here to look at Johnny, but there's this person, and that person also that engage in problem behavior. And, can you help me with them too? And of course, the answer at that point is no, because I don't have a referral and consent and blah, blah, blah. But I started thinking about what are some broader scale types of interventions that we could apply. And a lot of times too, when I'm observing in classrooms, I'll note what the extent to which there's a good structure, there are established routines, there's good classroom management and things like that. And so oftentimes, and sometimes schools get a little impatient with me, they just want a report to check the box to say that they did the functional assessment's been done and FBA's been done. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's necessary for the special education process in some cases. But I became more interested in hey, what can we do to shore up this classroom so we don't have to do a functional assessment? And so that's kind of where my interests lie right now is, what are some low tech, high impact interventions that can help all the kids in the classroom? And moving beyond that, if we're looking at individual interventions, what are some easily implemented interventions that we could put in place that may not necessarily require a functional assessment? So I use a lot of point-based reinforcement systems, token systems, things like that. I also work with families a lot too. I used to have this philosophy that, school is school and home is home and never the twain shall meet. The kids got to go home and, relax and whatnot. And over the years, I've started to see, especially with adolescent kids who are older than that a lot of these kids might engage in challenging behavior throughout the school day and then go home and access all the reinforcers at their disposal, like there's no skin off their back or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So over the years, I've been more so interested in working with families to see if there are things that we can do on their end to support improved behavior at school. So that's a lot, but that's just kind of like my overall philosophy of how I work now in school settings.
Cara, because you worked in schools as well.
Yes, I've had experience in schools.
Yeah, because I feel like, and I've spoken about this with other professionals as well in the field that are in the school setting too, I feel like it's like a continuous work, right? Like it just doesn't end in schools. It's when you go in at home, then you have the families, you have all that. The work, I feel like it's a constant one. Is that kind of like where you're at right now, Matt? Like I know you were just saying that, it used to be school trains shall never meet, but do you share the same idea that it's like it's a continuous work, that it doesn't stop at one point?
Yeah, so one of the things I do is to kind of, so let's say I have a kid on a point-based reinforcement system, and let's say I learn through conversations with the parents that their favorite thing to do, and this might come as a surprise to you guys, but most adolescents, their favorite things involve screens and things that you plug into the wall or have batteries, right? But kidding aside, I'll find out what their child's, how they allocate their time at home, and what do they spend the most time doing when they have their free choice of things to do. And what I'll do is, if the parents are willing, I will ask them to make access to those high interest items dependent on how they do at school, where they meet their behavioral goal. And that way, it doesn't end, as it were. So that's I guess, a time span as it relates to one day. And I always like to tell people, like, you're not taking it away. What you're doing is giving kids the opportunity to earn. It's no longer free. They're essentially renting their stuff, and they're paying with improved behavior. And there are ways to shape that up in such a way that we don't pull the rug out from the student. The kids always have access to lower preference preferred items as well. So it's not like they're on their hands and knees, like cleaning the floor with a toothbrush. That's not at all what I'm saying. But what I try to encourage families to do is to basically have the general philosophy that life is better for your child when they engage in improved behavior in the school setting. So that's a general philosophy. And then as it relates to kind of over time, that's a tough question. I'm working with a case right now where this is like, I almost rarely see this, but this teacher, she, surprise, she came from a behavioral program and she's now in the public schools. And her classroom is exceptionally well managed. And I'm worried about this kid next year. We're recording this in April. And so I'm worried about the transition of this student when the student goes to the next grade. And I had done a functional assessment on this individual last year. The team asked me to just basically update it. And all I did basically was characterize all the good stuff that's happening right now. I want to get it down on paper and in this kid's file, so that this kid moved or whatever, or transitioned, that they'd have some sort of record of what works, down to the details of actually taking a picture of her little star card and the school store and things like that. And again, I'm taking no credit from this. Is all the teacher's work. Again, she's just doing a phenomenal job. And I actually wrote into the recommendations that this teacher should train the next teacher, and if necessary, consult with that teacher next year, because she's close. She developed the intervention. She's closest to that individual, whereas I'm the guy with the visitor tag on. So I don't know. I maybe just answered the question I wanted to answer. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does.
That's really interesting. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about the effects of COVID and how that maybe affected some of your work. And also, everything just seems to blend together more now after the pandemic, with school and home and work and home. I know there were a lot of impacts on behavior, and some schools recognizing the need for behavior intervention where they might not have realized it before. So I'm just curious your thoughts on these post-pandemic years and how that's impacted your work.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you a couple things. One is, I think it severely, I don't know if you're following the issue of chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism, I think, is technically defined as a student missing more than 10% of the school year. I think that problem, I'm speaking kind of anecdotally here, so don't hold me to this. If someone out there has the real numbers and is fainting or whatever, don't send me an angry email. But I think the problem was trending in the wrong direction prior to the pandemic. And the pandemic basically just threw gas on the fire, just because it normalized being at home. And I think that was a really tragic side effect of the disruption in school services. It's a travesty in my view. Of course, everything looks different in hindsight, but even at the time, I was like, oh, this is not good. And so I think from an absenteeism standpoint, it really impacted things. And if you think about it, what does absenteeism do? It removes the student from the setting in which you want them to practice and receive reinforcement for appropriate behavior, right? So they have fewer bites at the apple, fewer learning opportunities. And if you think of problem behavior, in many of these cases, and many of the kids I work with, because of their problem behavior, or because some other maybe, developmentally caused learning challenges, academics is already a struggle for them. So a lot of these kids will, you might consider them curriculum deprived in many ways. And again, the pandemic just made it worse. So if you think about it from an escape standpoint, we have just increased the value of escape. And the value of escape is already pretty high with a lot of these kids because of because they're not on grade level. And so if you're doing math, and I've used this example countless times, but if you're doing math and you don't know your math facts and you're doing long division and you have to stop and consult a chart, or you have to use a calculator, that's going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to increase the number of links in that chain to get to the end of that problem. More simply stated, you've increased the response effort. And then within a given span of time, you're just not able to do as many problems, so you don't get the practice. You don't get the opportunity to build fluency. And so I think that's also a very unfortunate side effect of a lot of these things. And again, this was happening before the pandemic. I think the pandemic just accelerated it.
Yeah. It pointed out a lot of existing issues.
Yeah. In my view, made them worse. And so what's interesting is if you pull like a random fifth grader or fourth grader, fifth grader, and you ask them what 6 times 7 is, more and more that kid is not going to know the answer, or they'll be counting on their fingers, or they'll be using some sort of hack or trick or whatever to come up with that instead of just, coldly knowing the answer. Think of the ways in which we use mental math in our everyday lives. Something's on sale. You're thinking of whether to buy something in a store, or you're grocery shopping, and things like that. We're when you don't have those skills in your repertoire, it makes all sorts of things a lot more difficult.
Yeah, you're right. I was tutoring math for teacher candidates for a while. So I was working with adults who are working on getting their teaching certification. And I'm not that much older than them, but there was already a difference that I noticed in how I was taught those facts to be able to pull them out versus how they did, to the point where they were struggling with very basic math concepts. It's pervasive. It's interesting to see.
Yep. So there's an academic component. Another component is just, the opportunity to socialize and mature. So I have a friend of mine who's an 8th grade math teacher, and he's a classroom teacher. And when school started to resume somewhat normally, once kids started coming back to school, he said, these kids are like acting like they're 6-year-olds, not 8th graders. Like, he just saw a huge decrement in socialization, kids not being able to wait, take their turn, keep their hands to themselves, and things like that. They were acting like they were developmentally or chronologically, 3 or 4 years younger. Again, this is anecdotal, but I'm willing to bet that if there are other teachers listening to this, they're probably nodding their head in agreement.
Yeah. I guess one of the good outcomes of it was that there are a lot more schools that are understanding the importance of bringing in behavioral support and intervention.
Yeah, let's hope. A lot of schools are hiring their own BCBAs as well. So
yeah, and I've noticed too that it seems to be such a state by state thing. Like, there are some states where many districts have BCBAs in them, and then others that just don't. What are your thoughts on that from your own experience?
So I live in the state of New Hampshire. I do most of my work here, although I do some work in the state of Vermont. Excuse me. And one of the things you'll see in a small state like the one I live in is that there's quite a variability from community to community. And sometimes that will drive the availability to have certain supports in place. I don't want to get into a digression in school funding practices as it relates to, from state to state, but there is quite a bit of variability in school funding as well. So some districts might not have the funds to hire their own BCBA. They might, and there's a teacher shortage as it is. So excuse me, I got a frog in my throat. I apologize.
No, it's fine.
So a lot of districts are struggling just to cover the basics. They're looking for like a 2nd grade teacher, and so to contemplate finding a behavior analyst to come work for them is it's like, wait a second, I've got that's 10th in line of the needs. I have 15 open paraprofessional positions I need to fill. I have IEP services that are not being met because I don't have the staff to provide those supports.
Yeah, you're right. And something that I was thinking about previously when you were talking about teachers and classroom management in general. So talking about teacher burnout, especially when you're looking at these general education teachers, In my experience working in schools, I'm always just amazed at the amount of work that general education teachers do on a daily basis, just in managing 30 kids, usually it's somewhere around there, and knowing all of these kids, knowing where they are academically and socially. And so, how do you as a consultant come in and ask them to do anything extra? Like it's a very, I imagine, a very delicate balance, because it is such a hard job, but I imagine they're also open to anything that you might be able to provide them that's going to help them make their day easier. So what are some of those things you might ask them to do that could help, and then how do you present it in a way that makes it easy for them to implement it?
One of the things I try to do is keep the burden of what I'm going to ask them to do as low as possible. I very, very rarely have people collect ABC data, and we can get into why and maybe the value or the lack thereof of ABC data, given the research that we know as behavior analysts. But it seems to be this practice that's like almost like folklore-like that's handed down. There might be some cases where it is necessary. And more generally, I try not to ask people to collect data in such a way that is again so burdensome that it detracts from the other things that they need to do. And so there's a sacrifice that you need to make in terms of the data that I would like to see versus the data that is able to be collected. And there's almost like an inverse relationship. The higher the complexity of the data collection system, the crappier data you'll get in terms of data being collected. Whereas if you keep the data system easy to use and straightforward and manageable, you're likely to get more consistent information. It won't be as precise as you would want. So there's trade-offs. And if I really, really, really need to collect precise data, I'll do it myself and recognize that I can only do it for a short period of time because I don't live at that school. So that's the trade-off that I tried to make, which comes back to, I'm not going to try to ask the teacher to do something that's terribly onerous. I also try to get the teacher talking about, I try to keep the teacher talking more generally. Given the, I'll talk a little bit about this at that Babbitt event that we were talking about before we hit record. I'm actually doing a little bit on this, more so in the context of parents. But what I try to get the teacher just talking, and I try to get them to tell stories. And in those stories, you can generally parse out what was going on before, what was happening after, and you can develop, after listening for a little bit, you can develop some theories as to why, some hypotheses as to what's driving the repertoire. And you can do the same with the parents. So a lot of this is, I kind of do it more conversationally, but a lot of this was informed by the open-ended functional assessment interview that Hanley and colleagues put out many years ago. I don't follow that to a T. I don't even reference anything. I'm there with a notebook or my laptop asking questions. And again, I want the teacher to talk. I also want to be respectful of the teacher's time. So there's a couple like no-nos I try not to do. One is I never, a lot of times a principal will say, oh yeah, you're here for an observation. We're going to put you right into the classroom. And my first question is, does the teacher know I'm coming?
Yeah.
And most teachers could care less, honestly. They just want help. But I want to make sure the teacher knows I'm coming, just to be respectful, that it's their classroom. A lot of times, if I see a teacher that has the class engaged in a lesson and the kids are paying attention to he or she, I won't go in the classroom. Because if I open the door and step in, what's that going to do? It's going to interrupt the flow of the conversation, the flow of the instruction. They're going to be like, who's this guy? Yada, yada, yada. And now the teacher is making a voodoo doll that, a Matt Cicoria voodoo doll, in her mind. And I don't want to do that. I want to do things that develop, not detract from rapport. Along the same lines, what I like to do is ask the teacher, what a good time to talk would be. I don't just try to pull them and they're like, oh my gosh, I got to go pick my kids up from art. I don't want to put stress on them by just randomly trying to do some sort of interview. So I really try to make sure that when I do sit down and talk with them, that they've set ample time aside to have a productive conversation. Mm-hmm. So, and then lastly, I guess to circle back to your original question, is that once I've heard them and heard their concerns, I try to paint a picture of what things might look like if the student's behavior improves. And so only at that point where I've gotten some level of rapport, I'll start saying things like, it looks like you're spending a lot of time with Johnny anyway, right? What if we could spend the same amount of time, or very likely less time, but doing this instead, this being whatever intervention we settle on. What do you think about that? So that's I tried to change how I approach these conversations with people from somewhere, somewhat authoritative to more of a collaborative type of vibe.
Yeah, that's important. And then it's interesting. You have me thinking now about the transition from grade to grade and teacher to teacher, and how do you work that in proactively and think about either transferring or even fading those supports, just depending on what's going to happen next for that learner.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. I'm going to be candid with you. It's kind of a case by case thing. Some kids might need some sort of check in, check out, or some sort of reinforcement system. For quite a bit of time. There may be ways to fade out. Maybe you check in with them less frequently or things like that. And maybe you fade to a behavioral contract that spans multiple days and things like that. Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer because it's, the circumstances are so varied.
Yeah. But Matt, can I ask you a question really quick? Because you were talking about, basically like having the respect for the teacher and you build a relationship with the teacher. But I feel like it's not just the student behavior sometimes, it's also supporting the teacher behavior. How do you balance that support on student behavior and teacher behavior when they all go hand in hand?
Well, I'm trying to think about how I do this, but at least and as behavior analysts, I think we get this, instinctively. But sometimes school people think like behavior analysis is just like any other related service. Like the kid's going to go work with a speech language pathologist for a session and come back and have some improved articulation as a consequence of that intervention. Or they're going to work with an OT and they're going to be that much better at, fine motor skills like buttoning and snapping or whatever they're working on, handwriting, etc. Behavior analysis is a very different animal, and it's not necessarily what the students do. It's what the teachers and parents do that drives behavior. And so I try to get to that conclusion with folks soon into the process. I'm not here to work with the student directly, although we might from here and there. Certainly, I don't do work I don't do a lot of work at like that tier 3 level, working with kids with severe problem behavior and things like that, where you're doing like a skills-based treatment type of approach or a functional communication training type of approach, where it does make sense for the analyst to be in that role, at least initially, and periodically. My role is more consultative. So I try to get the folks to come to the conclusion that, they need to do things differently in order for the student to make progress. There's no magic to it, a concise way of describing how to get that point across.
Interesting. But Matt and Cara as well, because since I'm not a behavior analyst, I always think this is like super curious to me, which is like from both of you, since you already have that school experience, what do you think are like common missteps or like misconceptions in how schools usually address like emotional and behavioral issues as well?
Cara, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Oh my gosh, that's quite a packed question, Marc. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, Matt, what you just said is that thought that, oh, we're going to work directly with the learner and it's going to get better and then we'll move on, versus looking at like an entire like ecological assessment of what's going on in this setting. How is my behavior as a teacher influencing this? What am I reinforcing that I don't realize I'm reinforcing? A lot of times it's interesting. I was just at a convention where it was primarily special educators, and the conversation that happened over and over was, you do behavior analysis, I don't do behavior analysis. And then they go on to talk about what they're doing in their classroom, which of course it's behavior analysis. So I think there's this misconception of what behavior is and how it occurs and how we all contribute to it. And sometimes just explaining that, but using a language that's going to be accessible to teachers and not coming across as like stodgy, like, oh yes, this is me using all my ABA terminology, but more so talking about things like, oh hey, when you do this, the learner might end up doing, and talking about it more of just like this very straightforward manner where they're just like have those aha moments. I think that's an interesting way of doing it. But
I would agree. To your point, the one way to turn people off is to use things like acronyms, and overly unnecessarily technical language, necessarily, using jargon. When, if there's an easier way to say something,
Right.
Say it that way.
Yeah, even
You might
if
be.
like, your ABA professors would listen to you and be like, like sometimes in the real world, that's what's necessary to make progress in a setting and to build rapport and trust.
The only thing I don't compromise on is I still, data is a plural noun. That's the one I don't compromise on. So I will say the data show, the data are, things like that. I can't not do that.
My husband's a chemical engineer, and he always says, no, it's singular. That's how we use it in my field.
Show him that, show him Johnson and Pennypacker. That, there's a callback to Jim Johnston. Oh my gosh, if I said data as a singular noun, that was flushed out of my repertoire pretty quickly.
Oh yeah. The other thing, this was very interesting, just because these conversations are fresh on my mind from this convention that I was at. I would say to that, I talked to a lot of teachers. Oh, do you collect data in your classroom? No, I don't. I said, okay, so what do you do? We just do progress monitoring. And then as soon as I figured out, okay, this is a communication barrier here. So then as soon as I said, okay, so how do you monitor progress? Then they would tell me how they collect data.
Exactly. That's an excellent point.
Yeah. So there are a lot of similarities, but it's just a matter of finding that common ground and then just helping teachers understand really the entire context.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit out of school and just go a little bit into behavioral observations. Because I remember when I spoke with you the first time, we were talking a little bit about your podcast and how you created, and you've been one of the first people to do it. So back in 2016, like not many ABA people were jumping into podcasting. Like what inspired you to start your own?
It actually predated, it was probably around sometime in 2014 and 2015. And again, even at that time, I had been doing behavior analysis for a while. And I started noticing that there were a lot more people wanting behavioral services in schools, and a lot of teachers I started working with, special educators, were like, hey, I'm starting this ABA program because the field was starting to grow. And I was like, and at that same time, there was a lot, there was a huge growth in what you might consider the new media being things like, blogs, YouTube videos, YouTube channels, podcasts, things like that. And I consumed a lot of that type of media in different subject areas of my interest, particularly, when I first discovered podcasts, I was like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Because I spent so much time driving. I don't spend nearly as much time driving, but I would put over 25,000 miles a year on my car. Easy. And so I was in the car 2.5 hours a day because I live in a rural area. I consult the rural schools all over the place, and there's no straight highway to get from point A to point B where I live. And when I started, so it was a kind of a culmination of different things. At a certain point, I was like, I wonder if there's a podcast on behavior analysis. I'm listening to like these podcasts about sports and current events and all sorts of cool things like that, tech, whatever. And then I went to look for an ABA podcast, and I didn't really find any. I was able to find some ones that maybe put out a few episodes and kind of sputtered out. I know Amanda Kelly, AKA the Behavior Babe, had some podcasts for a while, and hers were more like, they were more about almost like tutorials on concepts that were brief, informative, but I don't know if there were many episodes out at that time. And didn't seem to me at the time, I could ask Amanda directly, I suppose, but it didn't seem to me at the time that those were an ongoing project, as it were. I think the first ABA podcast was the Precision Teaching podcast that Dr. Rick Cabina at Penn State did. I think this was like pre-iPhone, believe it or not. And he put out a number of episodes. The Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis did a few episodes. And actually what's common in the podcasting world is this thing called pod fade, where it's very reinforcing to plan and publish a podcast and get it started. And then you start getting feedback from listeners and the attaboys and things like that. And you can justify allocating whatever limited resources you have, time, etc., to devote to that activity. Then after a while, it becomes a job like anything else, or a thing on your to-do list. And at that point, you might satiate on those reinforcers, or the schedule might thin or whatever, and people stop doing it. So if you look at, if you go on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and you plug in ABA as a search item, you're going to see a lot of the ones that are currently out right now, but you're also going to see a lot of ones that have kind of come and gone. They haven't published an episode in like 2 years or something like that, 5 years, and so forth. I'm getting ahead of myself. But anyway, getting back to the origin of behavioral observations, I started thinking that, hey, maybe I should do something like this. I've been doing this for a while. Maybe I can help some people and whatnot. And I thought about different ways to do it. Maybe I can write a blog. And I was like, maybe I can do a YouTube channel. I quickly realized how difficult to do those things at a high quality were. Then I thought to myself, hey, what? The types of podcasts I like are like long form interview podcasts. What if I could talk to other people who are expert in their areas and I can just ask them questions? And therefore, the burden's on me to kind of curate the content and subject and the guest and the questions, of course, but I don't have to write essentially a term paper every week.
Right.
And so that appealed to me. I mentioned it to a friend of mine just in, over drinks, who's he's a programmer, and he got super excited about it. And he's like, oh, I will totally help you do this. So if it wasn't for my friend John's help, this never would have happened. But we ended up figuring out how to publish a podcast. And not to, give you the, like, I walked uphill barefoot in snow to school both ways bit, but it was a little more difficult to put out a podcast at that point in time.
At that point, yeah.
So I started planning the podcast, like early 2015, and I had recorded like at least a half a dozen episodes before I even published the first one.
Oh, wow. Okay. So has hosting the podcast changed like the way you consult or practice?
A while ago, I would have said maybe not, but I think it has given me a better ability to talk to people, because now I don't know. I don't think there's any way to measure that or anything like that, but I do feel more confident interviewing people. Like when I say interview, I'm not talking like clinical interviewing, not doing this kind of thing. I think I can organize my thoughts a little bit better when I'm talking to people, so I think I've gotten some help there. It would be hard to quantify this, but obviously I've gotten exposure to all sorts of different topics and things like that. Somewhere that's informed my practice. I can't point to a specific example, but I can't not be influenced by all the things that I've learned over the last nearly 10 years of doing this.
So whether in schools or through the podcast, what's one lesson from your work that you wish that more behavior analysts would internalize?
I think that one of the lessons is the things that we already talked about. We have to work with other people. Mm-hmm. We don't do this alone. Unless you have some very, very unique situation, you're not working one-to-one with a patient, client, student, whatever. Mm-hmm. And someone can have awesome technical skills and poor communication skills. And just because you've got the technical skills doesn't mean the client's going to benefit. So the more attention people can pay towards learning how to effectively communicate with stakeholders, that's something I think would be beneficial, because when you become let's say someone's an RBT in a clinic and they're really, really, really good at working with kids. They're a lead supervisor, they're moving up through the organization, and they go and take the courses and get their supervision. They sit for the exam. They pass it. They're now BCBA. Well, all of a sudden, they're not working directly with kids anymore. They've got to get other people to do the things they want. Mm-hmm. And as anyone in any applied practice can tell you, it's not as simple as just telling them what you want and it happening. So I think
it's interesting when people who are so good at working with the clients struggle working with other stakeholders, when at the end of the day we all are operating under the same principles of behavior. So whether you're working with a colleague or working with a supervisee, it all comes down to principles of behavior and thinking, what do I do to communicate best with this person? What are the contingencies in the environment that exist right now? Applying that regardless of who you're working with.
Indeed.
Okay, we're almost at the time. But before we go, Matt, I wanted to ask you one question that I'm going to start asking from our episodes onwards, which is, to finish this conversation, what motivates you?
Wow. That question is on brand, I guess. This is the Motivity Podcast. That's really difficult to answer. I just like what I do. Mm-hmm. I have friends, and again, not to beat a dead horse and tell you how old I am, but the conversation I'm having with friends, especially if I got some friends who are a few years older than I am, they're looking forward towards retirement and this, that, and the other thing. And I'm not saying I'll never not retire, but I get enormous satisfaction out of the work that I do. Now, I have some reinforcers that perhaps others don't have. I am self-employed. I don't have a,
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a boss I report to, although when you're self-employed, you have many bosses to report to, i.e. your clients. I like the challenge of kind of finding my own work and getting it. The podcast itself is, there's some aspects of publishing the podcast that, the editing, things like that, the publishing of it, there's some things that are not particularly fun about it. And I've kind of stubbornly refused to farm that work out, although I'm starting to just in some aspects of it. But, talking to people about behavior analysis, how fun is that? That motivates me. I'd like to continue to do behavioral observations so long as people are willing to listen. Now, if at a certain point people start saying, Matt, go away, maybe I'll listen to them. I don't know, maybe not. Who knows? But this is where my head is right now.
I love it. No, that's a great answer. So, Cara, while you're at it, do you want to answer as well what motivates you?
What motivates me? Goodness. Talking to people.
Yeah.
I love to talk to people and I love to learn from people. What I love about my job is just the diversity of people that I talk to on a daily basis and making those connections.
Yeah, I love that. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us. Cara, thank you so much, Matt. It's been an honor to have you here today with us. You're awesome and you're just such a nice person. So thank you for that. And Cara, thank you for joining us as well. We'll see you guys soon, probably on the next episode. But Matt, is there anything you'd like to share where people can find you? Anything you're working on?
Sure. I guess the home base for me is behavioralobservations.com. And that's where you can get all the latest episodes. You can get the show notes. Every show I produce has extensive show notes with references and things like that. So I try to pride myself on having a lot of material for folks to go look up should they choose to do so. And while you're there, hop on the mailing list. I don't send spam out or anything like that. I don't sell the email addresses to, Target or Gap or whatever. So if you're getting spam, it's not from me. But the only thing I do really is send out the show notes to your inbox, so you don't have to go to the website. So you could consider signing up for the mailing list there. Every once in a while, I'll send out something promotional if I'm running a sale on CEUs. I do repurpose some of these podcasts into CEU events. We've got about 65 events. I just put some new ones up actually. Wow. So you can get those there also. If you're interested in school stuff, I'm involved in another project with my colleagues, Dr. Polly Gavoni and Anika Costa. That's called thebehavioraltoolbox.com. And we're in the process of creating a library of video courses for school-based professionals. You don't have to be a behavior analyst to get into it. As a matter of fact, I've said from the start of this project, if we only sell to behavior analysts, this project will be a failure. So I'm hoping there are school administrators, school psychologists, special educators, et cetera, who can get into this material. But all the classroom stuff that we talked about, we've got courses on that, and we've got a lot. We've got a list of courses that we still need to produce. So if you're interested in that stuff, you can go to thebehavioraltoolbox.com. So those would be the two places I would direct people towards.
Awesome, that's amazing.
Check that out. That's super cool.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. See you guys on the next episode of the Motivators Podcast, and see you soon.